Hi, Michael.
Hi,
Thanks for joining me.
it's a pleasure.
Welcome to Meaning of Life TV. Let me introduce us. I'm Philip Menchaca, editor at Meaning of Life, and you are Michael Jerryson, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Youngstown State University, which I believe is in Ohio. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. You are also co-founder and co-chair of the Comparative Approaches to Religion and Violence through the American Academy of Religion. And additionally, you co-edit the Journal of Religion and Violence and are the author of the book Buddhist Fury, which I have a copy right here. So we will include a link to that for anyone who's interested. They can check that out. As you can see, I've made some notes. And today we're going to talk about links between Buddhism and violence, specifically in Thailand, which was a subject of Buddhist Fury. But to open, I want to start with just a bit more general question about Buddhism and violence. So, certainly in the West, I think a lot of people believe that Buddhism is a particularly peaceful religion, that it hasn't been involved in the kind of war and violence that other religions have been. And I'm curious what you make of that idea.
Well, it's a common reaction I get when I give talks at different universities, or even when I meet with Buddhist communities. I guess I understand where it comes from. If you look at the legacy, for example, of how Buddhism came into the United States through both practitioners of Buddhism, but also through people who wanted to learn more about Buddhism when it was not their own religion, the one that really took root, that I think spread into popular culture, came through making Buddhism palpable to, for example, in the West, to non-Buddhists, to Christians, to Jews. In that sense, they made it seem like a philosophy. So it would not be threatening or seen as competitive with the religions in play. And by making it seem only as a philosophy, they distilled things that they thought were not going to be unsavory. They wanted to just bring the attractive things that would seem more scientific into the fray. And so I think with that, and if you think about how the rise in the 60s and 70s interest in Tibetan Buddhism associated with the plight of Tibetans, that Buddhism has been, I think, characterized as being peaceful in that way. Of course, the problem is that we have a legacy in the West, I think, to look at Buddhist scriptures instead of Buddhist people, what they do, their own history. And again, I think it's within every religion, by the way, there's always a reticence to talk about the less savory characteristics or history in your own religion, whether it's Christians talking about the violence in Christianity or in Islam or even in Buddhism.
Yeah, that's a very nobody wants to air out their dirty laundry for sure. Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned the focus on Buddhist texts over perhaps the way that people actually practice it, and I think that too seems to be a very common way that people look at religion. In certainly when it comes to Islam. And what's happening with all the conflict today, a lot of people pluck particular verses out of the Quran and use it to justify, a particular view of Islam, and it's I think kind of misguided to believe that religion exists in a book or books.
I think following that too, I think it reveals what I think is a way in which we have been conditioned by the religions that have been dominated in our cultures in the West, namely, I think, Protestant Christianity, but even still Christianity as a whole, Judaism, and you could say even in some ways Islam, which has given, at least in its current forms, iterations, focus on scriptures. Mm-hmm. And while that might be important for these particular traditions in the current time period, they do not necessarily exist outside of that way. So I mean, I've given talks where I'll talk about relationship between Buddhism and violence, and I'll have professors say, well, Dr. Jerryson, you gave no examples of people using scriptures. How does that make it religious? And that's when I have to explain, look, for Buddhists, for example, in Thailand or Burma, they won't be reading the Dhamma or the Dharma. They won't be necessarily schooled in Pali or Sanskrit. But for them, religion is in the rituals they do, in the monks they converse with. That to them is the core. As people might think the core is the Bible or the Quran or the Tanakh. So it requires us to shift and think of things differently from what we were conditioned to.
Yeah, and this may be a bit of a tangent, but I'm gonna head down this path for just a minute. Certainly in the West, we have this history of starting with Luther, where you split the spheres of the secular state and religion very kind of cleanly. As time went on, the separation became more and more clear. Do you think that perhaps one thing that's going on here is that Buddhism, as it's practiced in traditionally in Asian countries, there's less of that separation between lived religion, I guess, and sort of official orthodox religion?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, certainly we have a legacy in Christianity. It's back to the City of God, by the way, of Augustine, of this distinction between the realm of politics of humans versus the realm of the divine. I think you could look to early Indian darshanas, philosophical schools, that I think some of them try to do the same thing. For example, the Nyayas, for example, and others that try to do separations. But what I see happening, though, is that whenever you do a quote-unquote separation, a secularism that you talked about, secularism is only understood based upon what it's opposing, right? And its opposition, for example, in the United States, is of, again, I would say Christianity. And even still, it forms and shapes itself based upon what it's trying to separate from, which is Christianity. Henceforth, the secularism in the United States is going to be different than the Nehruvian forms of secularism in India versus the secularism in Thailand. I mean, so you talk to people in Thailand of government, they'll say, no, we have a secular state, they'll argue. Just as how in the United States, we have a secular state. Although, if you look at our country carefully, whether it's a dollar bill, in God we trust, the Pledge of Allegiance, to putting your hand on the Bible at the courts, we have religion throughout our system. But it's in a different way. And I think sometimes it's not very visible to us because it's normal to us. But the other countries might, in their fashions of that amalgam, is not normal to us. So it's more visible to see the intersections of religion in that way.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah. So turning to your book, Buddhist Fury, this was, you'd gone to Thailand. This was, I guess, the early 2000s, right? Mm-hmm. And this was when there was quite a bit of violence. For people who may not be familiar with the conflict happening there, this was between majority Muslim population in the south of Thailand and minority Buddhists in that area, although Thailand as a whole is majority Buddhist, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So to give people a sense of really how bad it was there, is there an example of sort of violence that has taken place that you either saw or heard about while you were there?
Oh, there's a lot of violence I saw. All right, so put this into context. So I was teaching at Mahidol University in the College of Religious Studies for the full year when the violence erupted. Now, there's been sporadic violence prior to this, but this was in January 2004 when it began. Buddhist monks were being shot and killed on their morning alms. And for those who are not familiar with this, in Thai Theravada Buddhism, every morning monks would go on alms with their bowls out. It's a great way for Buddhists to make merit. And it's actually the most egalitarian way, I think, for them to make merit. Because it doesn't matter if you have wonderful caviar or if you just have rice. As long as you give a little bit of what you have to the monks, you're making merit. And so the monks would always go on the same routes each morning, and they became prime targets for these militants, these insurgents, to target and kill them. And that led me to think about, when I went down there, I wanted to see what was the response to targeting monks? How were monks responding to this? At the time, too, the insurgency, as we now call it, in the South, while it's infused, I think, with Islamic principles and ideas, is very much a regional battle of trying to regain for them a sense of autonomy from what they feel is a Thai Buddhist state that has been pushing their own sense of ethnicity and religion and culture onto them. And so in the insurrection that they've been doing was very grassroots. They would have random bombs that would go off, beheadings, shootings, arson attacks, oftentimes. And the problem with these attacks versus other way around the world is that people wouldn't claim responsibility for them. You wouldn't know who was doing this or why. And so initially, in 2004, when this happened, and I think for the first year and a half, everyone was living with a state of fear constantly, because you didn't know when you went out if you're going to be a victim of violence. And so for the first year and a half, for example, I couldn't find commercial vehicles, taxis, tuk-tuks to take me around because it was just too violent. Now, after a few years, this receded, but when I went down there, that was what was happening. And in response to the attack on Buddhist monks, the government had set up and tried to defend their monks. They had put their military in Buddhist monasteries as a way of shielding the monks and also securing their military. So this is so you went in there, you'd see checkpoints when you walk into the South. When you went in to show your ID, who you were. When you got in there, your cell phones no longer work. You had to go to a special store and call in and get your cell phone recognized, identified with your passport to suddenly have it working. Because shortly after they killed those monks, martial law was declared, which has been going on for the last 13 years, by the way. And so it really is like entering into a new area when you went to the deep south, which is the three southernmost provinces of Thailand.
And do you know what the hoped for outcome of the violence? Is it a secessionist movement, or is it more vague than that?
Well, I mean, we've had for the last 13 years, people like Don Patan and other reporters have been able to talk to some of the insurgents and hear from them. So for the most part, many of them really want autonomy. It's or to separate from Thailand. There was a National Reconciliation Committee that was formed in 2006, 2 years afterwards, to figure out what would it need to placate the people involved. And at the end of it, when I talked to some of the members, they said that what the insurgents wanted was too much that the state could provide. And I think this exposed, the fragility of the Thai country, Thailand itself. There's concerns in Thailand because you have all these different quadrants. You have Isan, where it's very predominantly Lao and Khmer, and it's poor usually in the northeast. You have the northern region of what used to be the kingdom of Lana, which is now Chiang Mai. So each sector has its own particular culture, its own previous political past or kingdom, so forth. And while the South used to be an Islamic kingdom called Patani for centuries, the fear is that, well, in the current day, we're all supposed to be together. We're all Thai. And if we grant these people in the South a sense of autonomy, then the Isan people are going to want it. And then the people, the Paknua, the people in the North are going to want it. And the whole country will fall apart. That was the fear. But I mean, for example, people were upset as early as the 40s and 50s about how the Thai government forced Malay Muslims to go to Thai Buddhist schools, bow to the Buddhist statue, stop learning their native language, Bahasa Melayu, which they write in an Arabic script. And so I think from the people who are fighting, they feel that their own history, their culture, who they are is in danger, and they want to preserve it. And there had been attempts when I was there in 2004, 2005, 2006 for Al Qaeda to try to link up with this Muslim insurgency. But for the most part, Al Qaeda couldn't get a foothold because the people there weren't concerned with transnational issues, global issues. They weren't worried about a war beyond their confines. They just wanted their area to be free of what they thought was a colonial dominance pushing on them from the central Thailand.
So is there very much in Thai government an effort to make Thailand a Buddhist country? You said that they were, having the Malay Muslims go to, couldn't go to Muslim schools and so on. Is there sort of an effort to make Thailand Buddhist? Full stop.
Yeah, I mean, I think on different levels. So there's that subtle level we just talked about before, that secular level, which I think is hard for people to understand. So here's an example. In our country right now, in the United States, people might go to Sunday school or Hebrew school to try to supplement their education, to remind them of their heritage. Now, the southern Thailand, it borders Malaysia, and for the longest time they had madrasas, pondoks. They had places of learning, and in which you learned the Bahasa Melayu, which was the language for them. And so, by trying to enforce a Thai-only language, it was difficult because people were not raised in families that spoke Thai. I mean, some people are illiterate with speaking Thai or reading Thai in southern Thailand. But two, they felt that it would be at the expense of learning their own language that they thought was dying out, that was important to preserve. And then whenever I think you look at a conflict, it's important to try to keep in mind what are the perspectives from these different parties. And so the perspective, again, from the Malay Muslims is that they believe that they are the cradle of Islam in Southeast Asia. And historically speaking, it was. I mean, it used to be, like I said before, Patani used to be this great Islamic kingdom that had some sort of tributary status with Siam or Sukhothai before. But, I mean, if you think of Southeast Asia, when Islam really took root in what is now Indonesia, but you're looking at the 10th century or 11th century onward, there was so much people going on pilgrimages, many places to the south, to that area. So they felt that we have to preserve this. They thought this is supposed to be that kernel that has to be kept alive. So for them, any ways of receding that, of learning Thai, and in learning Thai, the Thai cultural ways of deferring and bowing to monks, bowing to your teachers in certain ways, had with it, again, that subtle Buddhist for them flavor that wasn't overtly Buddhist, but for them was certainly not of their culture. And again, if you look at it academically, the Thai language itself has a lot of language that is derives from Sanskrit. It's not derived from Arabic. So, I mean, there's bits and pieces of, I think, historical accuracy in their fears and their claims. Now, you can go further than this. This is where the Buddhists get involved there in the south. And they go, aha, but before there was Islam, there was a great Buddhist kingdom here. And so there was the kingdom of Lankasuka, of Sri Vijaya, this thalassocracy, Buddhist area, which you had over 1,000 Buddhist monks who flocked to this area that were Malay, and they were Buddhists. And the Buddhists said, we have to preserve this Malay Buddhism. This is really important for us. And so there's different layers of history giving sense to legitimacy and what they feel is the rights to defend taking place there.
Yeah.
But going back to your earlier question, though, this is what I think was happening after the conflict began. So when the monks began to get targeted and killed, they were also targeting and killing imams. The insurgents were killing imams, they're killing Muslims. In fact, statistically speaking, more Muslims have been killed in the South than Buddhists. Now, we have to understand that when we're saying this, because only less than 20% of the population is Buddhist.
Okay.
Even though there's less Buddhists dying, a really huge percentage of the Buddhist population is being targeted.
Right.
That said, though, still, we have Muslims being killed, and a lot of them are moderate Muslims, ones who do not want to support the insurgents being killed off.
And are they being targeted because of that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And so the question is then, okay, so the government is putting armies, military, into these monasteries for the monks and protecting them, but I never heard when I was there of them doing that for the pondoks or the madrasas for the moderate Muslims and protecting the imams. So it exposed, in many ways, I think, this sort of conflation of Buddhism with nationalism. That the Thai government saw these monks as walking emblems of Thai nationalism. And that if a monk couldn't go on alms in the morning, it showed that the government did not have any sort of viability in that area. So they began to, for some areas, let the monks go on alms, but have soldiers walking with them as a way to say, look, we have control over this area. Again, conflating Buddhism with government. But they weren't doing this for the imams. So there were overt actions being done that seemed to be very much where the government was in line with Buddhism, and there were subtle ones that they were responding to. Yeah.
And were monks particularly targeted because they were easy targets, or because they were somehow seen as ambassadors of the state in some way, or supported by the state?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, one could think, okay, did these insurgents know before targeting these monks, did they really know the national value these monks had?
Right.
There's no clear evidence to show that. I haven't yet, but certainly since they were targeting, we know that they were a focus, and we do know that they're easy targets because you could map out where they were in the morning all the time. And certainly, though, the early attacks resonated because it did grow to national concern, international attention at times too, about monks being killed.
Yeah.
Then people got involved. So, in some level, when the insurgents wanted to have effects, they found that doing this did produce effects.
Yeah. And how did the monks respond to being targeted?
Well, this was the challenging issue for me. So when I first began this research, I was thinking maybe I should wait until the conflict was over and then talk to them afterwards. But who would have thought that 13 years ago it'd still be going on?
Yeah, you'd have been waiting a while.
So I would be waiting a while, for one. But two, there's the issue of, I thought, of memory. That whenever you try to recall something, we know this from the Holocaust too, that it's difficult to pull back memory and have it be chronological, to not have gaps in it. So I was worried about that, for one. And two, I was worried about the pressure to present yourself in a certain way. Monks are supposed to be ambassadors of Buddhism, right? And there should be models of this equanimity, of balance, of serenity, of peacefulness. So could they divulge the fact that they were fearful, or that they're upset or mad or angry? Would this be something that they would admit to?
Right.
So when I went down there, I thought the best thing to do this is then to live with them and to just see how the monks were affecting the violence on the ground and how the violence was affecting the monks. And I followed the military's geography. They had broken up the South into 3 different sectors: the green zone, the yellow zone, and the red zone. And the zones were identified based upon how many attacks took place. So the green zone was where the least amount of attacks took place. Yellow was where there's more, and red was the most attacks. What was interesting to me is when I would go to these different monasteries, everyone said the red zone was over there. It was never where you were. So they never really self-identified, yeah, this is the worst area. But so I went to the red zone, the yellow zone, the green zone, and lived with monks in these different monasteries. And for example, in the red zone, the monks would live with guns. They sleep with guns.
The monks themselves would own firearms.
Right. So, I mean, this one monk in particular, he explained to me, he's like, I would never shoot someone. But there had been attacks near his monastery where people were coming to steal the copper wire and to attack the monk, and they killed the monk and the novices there. And so another attack had taken place. This monk had simply fired the gun up in the air and scared them off. And so this abbot said to me, this is my intention, is that I have this gun so that if someone attacks me, it was just him and a couple, we call them volunteer monks, and the military living there. But before the military were there, he was like, I have no protection. Something happens to me. So this was his security. And he's like, I know it's a violation of the Buddhist doctrine, but I think it's a bigger violation to leave or to have me get killed and not be a support to the Buddhists in this area. Mm-hmm. So he had a gun not for aggressive behavior, but simply for defense and to scare people off. But then I also discovered a covert group of people that I call military monks, Tahanpra. These are soldiers that are in the Thai military that during training get approached and sent to monasteries to be secretly soldiers but become ordained as monks. And so they are serving both as soldier and as monks simultaneously. And I met several of them. This one monk pulled back the folds of his robe to display a Smith & Wesson tucked underneath the folds of his robe. And, his view was he gets paid a monthly stipend as being a soldier. The monks in the monastery did not know that he was a military monk. He was involved with leading rituals. He'd been there for so long. But he thought his role was necessary. He says, look, I've been trained as a soldier to know how to defend an area if something happens. So that I'm the best defense a monastery can have because they won't know I'm here. And when I pressed him about the ethics of the situation, I think he understood that it was a delicate situation he was in. Like, he didn't want to make it public knowledge that he was a military monk. He recognized the dangers of that, but thought again it was a necessity to have this because of that.
So was there any attempt to reconcile this theologically with Buddhist ideas? I mean, did they point to past examples of Buddhist leaders or the Buddha condoning violence or condoning militarization for specific reasons or in specific circumstances?
In the southern Thailand, no, I didn't have that sort of venture. I mean, it's almost like, I think again too, we're sitting right now in offices where it's air conditioned, I'm assuming, and we think we can walk to their store and we're not going to be fearful of our lives. These are people that day in, day out, you didn't know if you were going to die or not. It was a constant state of crisis, so much that I came down with PTSD from doing this research. And so I think we have to remember the particular context from which this mentality is born is from that. The need to survive was not something that was an abstract idea, but something you were living day to day. And everyone had friends and family that had been killed, shot, for no reason whatsoever sometimes. There was an old man that used to always come to this one temple in the Yellow Zone, where one of the monasteries I stayed at. He came usually in the afternoon, and one day he came over and he wasn't there, and I asked him where the old man was, and I said, oh, just the other day he was right in front of our monastery in the main road, and he got shot in the street with these people on a motorcycle. They stopped, cut off his head, and lit him on fire. So wow. This is something that is viscerally dismantling, right? For one, people are not thinking that they're in a crisis. It's the new way of thinking, one. Two, most Thai Buddhists are not steeped in learning doctrine. Again, I think this is a Western way of seeing religion, in which I think many Western Buddhists are. And they'll cite all the time a certain Dhammik Sutta or Sutra and say, what about this adage? But when I've talked with the Buddha Bala Sena in Sri Lanka, which is this very proto-nationalistic Buddhist organization, and the Mabata, the 969 movements in Burma, and they will cite certain things to support what they're doing, or histories to explain, justify what they're doing. Now they present, I think, a different context in which they're not living in imminent fear every day, but they nonetheless think they're responding to fear. That they are fearful, but it's a different type of fear, and allows for reflection, and they respond in such ways because of that.
So it's not as immediately emotional in those situations, in those other areas that you mentioned.
Right. So, I mean, in the South, in southern Thailand, it was prima facie logic.
Yeah.
That we are transgressing in order to defend the vitality of Buddhism. That can be wiped out from here.
Yeah. Yeah. And you had a essay on the website Eon, which we'll link to as well. And I believe it wasn't there. You pointed to a kind of cosmological justification about I gather some Buddhists perhaps in these areas have pointed to the story of the Buddhist end times as kind of a potential reason for taking up arms. Can you kind of explain what you meant by that?
Certainly, and I think this, by the way, I edited a book called Buddhist Warfare that has some great examples of this too. So this is actually a pan-Buddhist, pan-South Asian belief. Whereas Abrahamic religions usually have a linear sense of time with an end happening. South Asian religions, Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, thinks it's cyclical, right? But nonetheless, they think that there'll be an end to a cycle before the beginning of a new one. Mm-hmm. So there's the four kalpas. We call one great cycle a Mahakalpa, or sometimes I hear Buddhists call it yugas and Mahayugas. And at the end, the last period is the age of Kala. It's the age of deterioration. And all Buddhist traditions have believed that we're currently in the age of deterioration, the last quarter of the cycle, and actually the last part of that quarter of that cycle.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So we're right, and that's where human life becomes more difficult. And this is, for example, in Pure Land Buddhism, why the push is more for to go to Pure Land, because the times are so difficult right now. You need to go to Pure Land to get the proper teachings, because it's very challenging in this day and age.
Yeah, and Pure Lands are these other realms where you have advanced Buddhist teachers or even Buddhas still teaching, which one can commune with.
Right, you've got Amitabha who's there, Amida who's there to give you the teachings and help you become awakened.
Yeah.
Or we say enlightened in the West. And one of the indications of this, that the end times are happening, is the appearance of Metteyya or Maitreya, who is the Buddha to be. And so, because with each new era, there's going to be a presence of a new Buddha.
Yeah, so our Buddha's Gautama Buddha, and then the next era will be Maitreya, and so on.
Right.
Buddhas, yeah.
So, for example, the big full-bellied Buddha in China, for example, you always see with the huge belly, is often identified as Buddha or Hote. And it's believed that he existed about 800 years ago in China. And when he died, people believe he is a former incarnation of what will be the future Maitreya. Because you're born several times before you're finally born as the Buddha, right? So Maitreya will come eventually. So there's been messianic movements in Buddhism. Messianic being like they think end times are here. Sometimes surrounding the evidence of thinking that Mara, who is the nemesis of the Buddha, he's the incarnation and embodiment of lust and jealousy. There's famous, powerful examples of the Buddha meditating on the tree before he becomes the Buddha, and Mara tempting him. So there's conflicts in which Buddhist monks will say, this is Mara, we have to fight against Mara. Or they'll say that I am Maitreya, I am Metteyya, rally to my cause. And it's happened in China, in Korea, I mean, in many other places, this idea of the end times happening and the need to fight because it's end times.
And is there an idea too that by fighting they can preserve the true teachings a little bit longer and maybe put off this final end time
Oh,
for for a while?
absolutely, because I mean, the doctrines that talks about end times is very clear in that while the cycle is going to happen and while end times will finally happen and a new cycle begin, you can't avoid this. You can you can hasten it or slow it down. And the marker for this, there's different markers for this, but when the monks disappear or the Dharma is forgotten, as it begins to recede, so the faster the monks deplete, the faster the Dharma is forgotten, the quicker end times will approach.
Hmm.
So there's ways to slow it down, to preserve, if you can, what is before the end times happen.
Right. Okay, well, look, this has been great. This is fascinating, fascinating stuff. I wanted to ask you one final question. You told me that you're working on a new book about religion or Buddhism and violence. Could you just give a little explanation of what you're doing and what you're currently interested in?
Certainly, I was struck at one point by an argument with other scholars, Stephen Jenkins being one of them, who talked about the fact that the word ahimsa has been oftentimes mistranslated as nonviolence. And he's absolutely right. I mean, ahimsa means non-injury or non-harm, which sounds like it's the same thing. Well, it's not, though. It's a subtle shift. And it got me to think, okay, because oftentimes Buddhist ethicists talk about how ahimsa is paramount in Buddhist ethics. Non-injury, non-harm. What does that mean then? How does that affect in the study of Buddhism and violence? So, for example, the 14th Dalai Lama was interviewed several times about the self-immolations of these Tibetans lighting themselves on fire. There's been over 140 of these deaths. And he was asked, is this violence? And the 14th Dalai Lama said no, because these people they're not showing that they're in pain. They're not evoking, they're not harming anyone else. So where is the harm? Where is the pain? Where's the injury? And he's coming from defining it from a Buddhist standpoint. And I'm like, oh, wow, that's important then, because in this sense, we might be, without intentioning, trying to read Buddhism and violence from a very Western, non-Buddhist pathway. So let's look at it from a Buddhist standpoint. Is there harm or is there injury now? And so this book explores then that particular Buddhist definition of violence, of injury and harm, and where do we find that? So while I have a chapter that looks at, with all traditions, ways in which Buddhists have justified wars and conflicts, I have a chapter on how Buddhists have supported autocratic governments, where they think that they believe in Dhammic dictatorships. They think dictatorships, not democracies, are good, and support violent laws that are harmful. I look at the debate on gender issues, where there's a disallowance of females to become ordained in many Buddhist traditions, and how many women identify this as being harmful to them. So gender discrimination being a lens to understand Buddhism and violence. But at the same time, this book also explores the flip sides. Here are Buddhists engaging in violence, but also how Buddhists have to deal with, suffer through violence. So I have a chapter looking at Buddhists living in a conflict zone, how they survive that. How does Buddhism help them cope with violence? Or how do Buddhists deal with what they see as blasphemy, which I think is violence not only to something that's sacred to them, but violence to themselves. Buddhists have talked about crying when they come across Buddha bars or the Buddha heads that have been cut up with the flower pot with things going on them, or creating outdoor bathrooms with Buddha images on the toilet seats. I mean, so there's, in many ways, I'm trying to explore further then, from a Buddhist perspective then, how these things come together.
Yeah.
And it's called If You See the Buddha on the Road, Essays on Buddhism, Politics, and Violence.
And is that title taken from, I think it's a Zen koan or something? If you see the Buddha on the road, kill him or something? There's
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's a famous Chinese Buddhist monk who reportedly told his disciples, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. Which is a play in many ways because it's like a koan. It's meant to jolt you from your complacent ways of thinking. One should not seek the Buddha nature that resides within, the Tathagata, not an external Buddha for liberation, but search within yourself, not outside yourself. So this thought of killing the Buddha dislodges you from an illusionary perspective, right? It's supposed to be simply an analogy. But it highlights, nonetheless, how the idea of violence has a place within Buddhism, even metaphorically.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you so much. I look forward to that book, and maybe we can revisit it down the road.
Wonderful, Phil. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Yeah, it was very enjoyable. Take care.
You too.